going to turn the floor over to Dr. Houston.
Not yet. I got to earn that.
It's like you know how band leaders are called professor as a courtesy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we're going to call you doctor as a courtesy.
All but dissertation at this point.
No, I got to do like 2.5 to 3 years of research and then some writing.
We'll help you.
We're working on it. Anyways.
He's going to do a presentation and take it away.
Okay, so thanks everybody for coming, and if you've never been to one of my lectures before, you know, or if you've been, then you already know, I like to do a little bit of active learning, so we're going to have you all get acquainted with your neighbors at some point in the near future. So first off, I guess you all already know what the subject is going to be. We're going to be talking about wild bonsai, and that means different things depending on where you are in the country. So I've structured this lecture to have some specific advice for Ohio, and then some very broad advice that will be applicable wherever you go. So we're going to go over some basic things. We're going to go over the pros and cons of digging your own wild bonsai as opposed to getting bonsai from other sources. That part's kind of similar structure to the last lecture I gave on the seeds. And then we're going to go over the legal rules and ethics of bonsai, of digging wild bonsai, because that's kind of important. You know, we don't want to bring a bad name to the hobby by everybody going out and getting in trouble, getting fines, getting trespassing, that kind of thing. So we'll go over that, and we will learn kind of how to identify wild bonsai that have good potential. And in that subject, you'll find that there's a lot of overlap with just when you're looking for nursery stock. So we'll go over that. And we're also going to go over like the actual act of digging a tree and the aftercare. So after this lecture, hopefully you'll feel more confident going out and trying this. So first, the basic vocabulary. There's one Japanese word in particular that I'm going to use probably without noticing, so I'm going to make sure that you know it. And that is the word Yamadori. This is a big buzzword in bonsai, and it's the Japanese word for from the mountains. Kevin, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yama means mountain, Dori is basically to take away.
Okay, got it. So technically, we don't have any places in Ohio that are tall enough to be a mountain, but we still use that word. And then there's also another word which I call Japanenglish, and that is Yardadori. And that is, I don't know who came up with it. There was a time where I thought I came up with it, but then it was like all over social media, so I'm not sure that that's true. But it's, you know, suburban bonsai, or urban bonsai in that case, sourcing from landscapes. So I'll go over the pictures briefly. This one is early on in my collecting career. That's on in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington. And then that one is actually from Ohio. It's Buckeye Lake. There was a family there that they were expanding their porch. So they didn't want these row of large boxwoods anymore. So that's how I got that one. Okay, so here we're going to go into the discussion with your neighbors, your small groups. Start off. Take 30 to 60 seconds, just first things that come to mind. What are the pros of digging your own wild bonsai as opposed to getting bonsai from other sources or pre-bonsai? So talk with your neighbors for a minute and then I'll call on people. I love the vigorous conversation. Now let's share out some of those ideas. Who wants to go first? Kevin?
You have access to age, wide age range, and character and size.
Yes, wide age range, wide diversity of character depending where you're looking. Any other ideas?
Cheaper.
Oh, cheaper, that's for sure.
Or free.
Or free, yes. That's the ideal for me, you know, grad students. But Richard?
You want a con?
Oh, we're going to get to that next.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So any other ideas on the pros? Jerome?
I find when you give areas that have been clear cut or brush hog, or rodent or deer infested, little miniature trees.
Yeah, so you can kind of find some areas where something has happened. There's like some cataclysm for the tree, but it makes something a little more interesting already that you just find it and it already has some good qualities. You in the back with the beard, I don't know your name, sorry.
I think just the since it's a tree and it's living its life, it's like more immune to diseases and stuff. Like rookie sapling could be it.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So some certain species around our area are more susceptible to disease. And if you get one that's older, you've probably selected for one that's already maybe has a better genetic resistance to that disease. So that might be one thing. Richard?
A pro would be, you're gonna find a tree that's native, or should hopefully native to this climate, so that you know it can grow in your climate. If you get a tree from Washington State and bring it to Ohio, it might not like our summer and our rain, so that's a pro that it's naturally found, hopefully not invasive.
Yep.
That's a good pro.
That's a very good pro. Brent?
Well, he touched on it. It's a good way to fight invasives, like going out and taking down the honeysuckle.
Yeah.
Kind of problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Trey?
I feel like it tells a story. Like you get to talk about this like land wherever you got it, and it's like from the piece from that land. So it's almost like kind of you take a piece of it home, and you have a story around.
Yeah, I like that point. I didn't think of that one, but that is a good point, especially when you think about once the tree is ready for show. You know, in the traditional Japanese display, we often try to make the story of where the tree may naturally live. We'll try to bring that to the viewer. So if you were the one that dug it yourself, you'll know exactly what elements you may want to incorporate in that story to give that image. Kevin?
I guess 2 points real quick is that conservation, American chestnut, you might be able to find something you can grow it that way.
Yeah.
And also fire prevention, depending on where you're shooting. You can get understory brush and just clear out the fuel that is waiting fire.
That's a good point. One that we may want to talk about at some point, I don't know if that we want to have a huge tangent about it, but I've noticed that there's a lot of ash trees. So ash are critically endangered because of the emerald ash borer. But if you go into the forest in Ohio, you'll see a lot of ash saplings or like trees below a certain height. So it seems like the younger ones don't get targeted for the beetle infection. So given that they're endangered, keeping them as bonsai may be one way long term to kind of keep some of that genotype around. Kenny, yeah.
That's actually true, Ryan, about the ash borer beetle. They only attack a certain age or tree or diameter. I read something about it a couple years ago. I don't remember exactly what it said. But yeah, they don't bother smaller trees and saplings, only the bigger ones.
Yeah, that's good to know that. Richard?
Your American chestnut is, you know, the Adelphia parasitica, we studied at West Virginia University. They grow suckers with stumps, and they get to a certain height, and then you can take them, and then you protect them. But when they get to a certain height, then the infection sets in, and you lose your tree.
Okay, so if it's small enough in that case too, you also can protect it from infection.
Yes. And once you get to a certain age, they get susceptible, and then they go down.
Interesting. So I think that's a good list of pros. We'll kind of see if we all came up with the same one. So I figured, yes, it's cheaper to dig them yourself. If you want to buy a Yamadori, though, those tend to be more expensive than your typical nursery stock. So that's one consideration. Oh yeah, it's a great way to get old, unique material. We did talk about that. This is a sugar maple that I dug up, one of the very first trees I dug up here in Ohio. And I kind of liked it. It reminds me of like a Apatosaurus, Brontosaurus type thing, if you ignore that second dead trunk. So that one is still recovering, and I'm hoping in the near future it looks like it's waking up very well this year, so hopefully I can work on it more in the future. And here we did touch on this a little bit, so it's a good way to experiment with new species, and you can rescue plants that would otherwise have been destroyed. So last year I had this privet that I collected in Washington. Both of the privets I showed last year, they were dug in 2020, the summer, spring 2020, and shown in 2022. So they ramified very quickly, and those were also trees that were unwanted. They were just part of a landscape, volunteers, and they didn't want it anymore. So that's why I dug them up. And then here's some other reasons. So it's a nice adventure, kind of like what Trey was saying. You get to go explore the environment where these trees are from. It brings us closer to nature, and it's a good workout, especially if you use manual tools. So John knows about that yesterday.
Oh, I was in beast mode.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's part of the reasons why I enjoy it. And this is a picture of my car dirty off-roading, or not really off-roading, but on a logging road in Washington. So all the scratches and dents on my car are from overgrown trails. Okay, now let's go into cons. So again, talk with your groups for 30 seconds or so. Let's see what are the first things that come to mind for disadvantages of digging your own wild bonsai. Again, what were the ideas? What were the ideas that you came up for disadvantages here? Dan?
Could you accidentally bring a disease or a bug into your stock?
You definitely could do that. So, especially if you're not too familiar with the species yet, you may not know what you're supposed to look for in terms of certain diseases that species is susceptible. So, like a big one nowadays is the boxwood blight. So if you're going to be digging boxwoods, you might want to check the boxwoods that you're digging and keep them quarantined away from your other boxwoods that you already have while they're doing their recovery. But other species may have examples too. Richard?
One con is if you grow from seed, you can create a style early on. I'm more of a grower. My first tree took 15 years. It was a lollipop and turned it into a literati. Took 15 years. So when you dig them up, when you see the videos on YouTube when people are digging up trees and doing demonstrations, they're stylists. They're styling a haircut. Get a haircut, put in the pot, give it a haircut, wire it, you're done. It's a masterpiece. I'm more into growing my trees and over years and time to develop what I have a vision for. So that's a sort of a con on that side for me personally.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if you were to collect some younger material, you could still do some of that, but like a very old material, a lot of things are kind of set in stone, like the basic movement of the trunk or things like that. Kevin?
Higher chance of death.
Higher chance of death, that is a big one. If anybody's already tried this, there is a certain failure rate.
Yeah.
Be prepared for that.
Yeah.
Zach, you had a point?
It relates to that. If you're just starting out, you don't necessarily know where the roots go.
Yeah.
And that comes with experience and failure. So you may have a tree here and the roots are in a crack over here somewhere.
Yep. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, about like how to suss out if a tree is collectible. But that is a good point. You kind of need to experience maybe some painful lessons to learn how to tell that. But hopefully this lesson maybe will cut down some of that time. Any other points? Dwight?
There are some limitations as far as what you're going to find growing around where you're.
Yes. Like you're probably not going to find a wild shimpaku. You can only find certain species that are volunteering in your area or whatever area you're going to. Brent?
When you said shimpaku, I mean, some of the popular areas and species have been over-collected.
Yeah.
It's not it's finite.
Yes. In Japan, I don't know if everybody's heard this story, but a lot of the best bonsai in Japan, they started out collecting wild bonsai from the mountains. And then over time, bonsai became so big in Japan, so many people doing this, that they collected almost all of the wild old shimpakus that were worth anything for bonsai, and the government, I believe they made it illegal to collect wild bonsai there, so then now the nursery trade has taken over. So in America, that's a little bit less of a concern because we have less people doing bonsai and we have a very large space, but definitely we're going to talk about that in the ethics part. You don't want to over-collect any given area, especially you don't want to affect the ecosystems.
And the last con is like if you want pine trees, you're not going to find them here. You get yellow pine, and so your selection is going to be limited to what's in the environment. But that's okay.
Yeah, pine trees are a little bit of a challenge, and I've been looking. So we can talk about that more specifically later on. I think certain places you're more likely to find them, and just kind of the more experience you get in an area, you may kind of start to know where to look. On that point, Rob was suggesting to me that I go find some hill that has like a southward slope, because then it'll get more sun and there may be more pine trees there.
Well, it's the rain. It's the rain. Japanese blacks won't grow in Ohio.
Yeah.
Not wild. You don't see them.
Yeah, what I'm finding, I'm not looking for the Japanese black pine. I'm looking more for like pitch pine. So I haven't sussed this out yet, but I've been noticing along the highways there's lots of pines, and I think it's because they get more sun. So that's kind of where in the future I might start looking. But anyways, we will go over these cons now that I thought of, and I think we hit most of them. So that's it, maybe. Okay, well, we will do it this way now. Right? Okay. Okay, so in some areas it's hard to get permission. That's a big concern if you're collecting in the eastern US, like we are in Ohio. So state parks, state forest, national park, those you all cannot collect in. National forests, sometimes you can. We'll talk about that later. So the getting permission is hard, and sometimes even from private landowners, you know, it's just kind of like shooting in the dark, hoping that this stranger will let you dig on their land, you know. But if you don't reach out, you'll never know. And the other part is finding a collectible tree. And Zach touched on this. This is a picture I took in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. This is actually an area where you're not allowed to collect, but it's a protected wilderness area, very high in the mountains. And you can see this tree is coming out of a rock crack. And there's really no roots to speak of. It's all in the crack, and there's no way to get any of the roots alive out of that tree. So that's one of those, sometimes you'll find a tree like that, you just better admire it where it is and don't have eyes bigger than your stomach, so to speak. You know what I mean? Oh, okay, this is working again. Okay, so we also talked about how you have a high chance of failure, and trees may, I'm going to change that to will die. Even I lose trees, and I've dug like 140 trees in the last 2 years, so that's why you dig a lot of trees if you like it, because you know that some of them are going to die. Although I heard from Jerome that the honeysuckle he dug last year, or no, Dan said this actually, none of the honeysuckle he dug died, so certain species definitely have lower risk of failures. But if you have a tree that you have a little bit of an emotional roller coaster watching it, waiting to see if it recovers, so that's one thing to factor in. And this is a mountain laurel that I collected last year, and this is one that unfortunately did not make it. So my advice that I try to follow is when you have a new species, collect some smaller examples to kind of get to know that species before you go for the big ones. That one I did not follow my own advice for, so I'm regretting that decision now. But if I see any other mountain laurels, I'll try to learn more about that species. And then we have, low bonsai action. So we didn't mention this one, but especially the first year, you really shouldn't be working on a freshly dug tree. It's kind of like after a repot, you need to let it grow new roots and get more energy and recover. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the older the tree, the longer that recovery time may need to be. Okay, so just briefly, here are the alternatives. I have a feeling you all mostly know these already. You can propagate by cuttings, if you're good at that kind of thing. I know Mark is kind of an aficionado there. You have air layers, and this is one that is it's good to practice maybe in May and June here, so that season is coming up. Basically, for this one, you grow the roots on an existing branch and clone the tree that way. Then nursery stock, I'm sure everybody has tried this at some point, and seeds, which we lectured about last November, and you can find that on my website. Okay, so now we're going to go over the rules and the ethics. So for rules, let's start speaking legally. I already touched on you could get cited for trespassing, you could get cited for removing a plant from a protected area, and that second one in particular is a very hefty fine in some areas. I heard about a guy in California who got a $1,000 fine for digging a tree in the wrong spot. So even if you do get permission from a certain national forest, you better know which areas that national forest will let you dig in, because they have their own restrictions. And for private land, if you're walking in your neighborhood, one thing that I do is if I see a tree that they don't want, or that's just like a volunteer, I'll take one of these postcards from last year's show, since we don't need them anymore. You should take some too. And I will write them a little note, and I'll say, hey, do you mind if I dig this tree from your yard that you clearly don't want? So get to know your neighbors that way. And if it's somebody in your neighborhood or in your area that you don't know who owns the land, then you can use some online resources to figure out who owns the land to contact them. So I list some of those here, just so I guess you know. There's like Gaia GPS, Base Map, Acre Value, and OnX Maps. I guess Mark.
In Ohio, ownership of land is a public record, so it's easy to find out that information at the county auditor's office.
Okay, so the county auditors, like if you just email them or something?
You go to a website, if you
Okay.
know the address, you'll be able to find out the owner of that property.
That's good to know, because all of these resources I listed here, they have kind of like a map, but usually they make you pay to see who owns the land. Onyx Maps is one that's popular among hunters, so, but that sounds like a better solution I mean, I don't want to pay, so I'll try that instead. Okay, so I've already mentioned U.S. National Forests. We do have one national forest here in Ohio. I've already asked them. They said we cannot dig any trees there. The closest I found was like North Carolina and Tennessee. So you can usually go to the National Forest website and see if they have what's called a transplant permit. That's what you should look for. And then you'll be calling the individual ranger stations to see if that area will allow you to get a permit. In some western states, they also have what's called a Bureau of Land Management. So that's another good resource. And in Ohio, we have more like county departments of transportation, like we were talking about with the pines along the highway. That's who I'll be contacting for those. Oftentimes, especially like next to highways, next to railroads, they'll just cut all the trees under or like above a certain size. They'll just kind of do a clear cut like this. So then all of these things, you can use for bonsai. Or if it's been several years since they have cleared them, then you can get ones that have kind of like grown up after the cut. So it makes like a good scar and a change of direction in the trunk. Okay, now talking about the ethics. So the two main points that I thought of that I try to always follow is backfill any holes that you dig. So this is just something that's gonna allow the next plant to sprout in that spot. And if you leave a big hole on somebody's private land and they trip there, they may not want you to go back and dig there again. So some things to consider there. Also, what I try to do when I go to any particular site is I try to make sure that the species that I'm digging, it's not the only example of that species there. So that way there will be more parent trees to make more good bonsai for us in the future. And one species that's endangered, or let's say a species that's not endangered is what I mean to say, it may not necessarily be common in every area of its range. So that's one thing to consider. Even in Ohio, going to different forests, you'll find it's kind of patchy. Like some forests you find a lot of birch, or a lot of cherry, or a lot of white pine, and then other forests a lot of beech or hawthorn or different things like that. So I'll try to pay attention to what I'm seeing there. And this is just an example of a hole that I've backfilled. So often I'll take leaves and dead branches and things and kind of use that to cover the top. And that will all decay eventually. So, one other thing here. Obviously you want to do leave no trace, don't leave any trash behind. So those are good considerations. And I already mentioned some tips here, but generally just kind of being neighborly will get you pretty far. If you get to know your neighbors, they won't be so shocked when you ask them to dig up their bush or something like that, Also, if you offer to pay for a plant or to replace it if it's in somebody's landscape, they may be more amenable to let you dig that one. And, I had one more point here. So if you're gonna offer to pay, let's say you're really dead set on this plant, you're just contacting a random person who has no connection to you, one suggestion that I've heard is that you should get the small, $1 bills, and then offer it to them so they can see the amount of money. So it seems like a lot of money. Psychologically, this person claimed that helped his success rate. I haven't tried that, but you may go out and try that. He also suggested, to ask for, if you're like Kevin and you have a baby, go walk your baby and then ask while you have your baby so that you won't seem like a threatening stranger, you'll be like a friendly stranger. That kind of thing, I'm sure Juniper will appreciate it. You can tell her, oh, I got this tree from you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, dogs, babies, however you want to do it. So, I will say, for the most part, I haven't had to pay for trees. Most people, if you know somebody who owns some land or they have some volunteers, weedy trees that they weren't intending to plant there, they don't mind if you take it. So Just ask around. You have to ask to find out. Okay, so I wanted to, when we're switching into the topic of like identifying trees that are good for bonsai in nature, I wanted to first talk about the actual forces that will make a naturally stunted tree. And I think some of you may have some ideas already. The first one is quite obvious. It's if you constrain the roots, you'll limit the nutrients, and then you'll get a tree that grows much more slowly. So this is a pitch pine in a state park in New York City, or not New York City, but New York State. So then the next 2 points, they kind of overlap with that strategy. You have a water limitation. So in some very arid environments, the lack of water will also make trees grow very slow. And this is a tree that my bonsai teacher had, and he called this tree his Methuselah. He used a it's called referential ring counting, basically. So he had 2 branches that they had bent and turned upwards. And this tree was fallen on its side when he found it. So he reasoned that the erosion of the rock, which exposed these roots, is what made the tree fall over. And then that light tropism is what made these 2 branches turn upwards. And so he cut one of those branches off, and he found, after counting the rings and sanding that branch, he found that there was 900 rings in that branch. So at the time that the tree fell over, it was 900 years old.
Wow.
And this tree came from Wyoming, and some areas of Wyoming, they get less than 12 inches of precipitation a year. So that's kind of how that may work in those extreme environments. Also, excess water can be one thing that can slow a tree's growth. So this is a tree also from Dan Robinson, and it came from Vancouver Island, Canada, and they have lots of kind of coastal bogs that get a lot of water, and they're also very acidic, which is another factor that can slow the growth. So this tree, originally it was buried up to here, and so this was all roots, and he exposed it over time. But the main thing to think about in a bog is that everything is very wet, and then there's kind of like these islands of moss. And so the islands of moss, as the plants slowly grow, they slowly accumulate and get taller. And then the tree will make new roots as it grows taller. And the water level also can raise over time. And so the water is really confining the roots to that small little moss island. So that's another way that you can find naturally stunted trees. Swamps, like in the southern US where you get bald cypress, they may work similarly. Also, another point I wanted to add here was genetics. So kind of like with the boxwood, certain species, they're just going to grow more slowly. This one is a mountain laurel, also from the same state park in New York. We do get a couple of these here in Ohio, but I haven't seen any worth collecting. But it's kind of evolved to be an understory tree, so it's already a nice bonsai size. And then we also get into pruning. So in Ohio, you can get pruning a couple different ways. If you find something that's deer browsed, or in this case cattle browsed, then they get nicely ramified. Also, you can get some, if you were to manually prune a tree, then you can get a nice ramification on that, just like with your bonsai. And this is an example. I didn't include the full trees picture because I wanted you to see the leaves better, but this is an ash tree that I took a picture of in Salt Lick State Park in Kentucky. And it had one ash tree on the ground, which somebody had cut down, and then it seemed like it had been deer browsed. So it was just kind of like yay tall and very dense. And I picked off an average sized leaf of that tree. And then I picked up a leaf of the same species from a neighboring full-size tree. And you can see that the one that's been browsed is over half the size, or under half the size of the full-size tree. So I thought that was an interesting example because ash is kind of a larger leaved species. You can see it has compound leaves there. But there's many other factors that may come up when you're looking for like what makes a tree naturally stunted. Okay, so here we're going to discuss again. These are some examples from Perry State Forest here in Ohio, and I just wanted to allow you guys some time to discuss what are the good or bad qualities of these trees for bonsai. Would you want to dig any of these up, or which ones? So take again 30 to 60 seconds with your neighbor, pick one or two of the trees to talk about it. take the trees. Let's take the trees one by one. Who had some ideas on pros or cons of the first tree? Somebody said inverse taper. Doug, was that you? Yeah, so it does have some inverse taper here. So, are you saying that's a con?
I'm saying it's a con.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Chris had a good notion here where he said it depends on what your goals are. So if you want a very traditional tree that has nice taper all the way up, that would not be the tree to do. Kevin, you got a point?
With the inverse taper, you can utilize it as an undulation or a curve that's already rounding itself. You can emphasize if you were to plant it differently.
Yes, you could try to accentuate it. So if anybody who's seen some of my trees, you know I like deadwood, I like scarred trees because it kind of shows more of a story. So you could try to make a feature out of it.
Yeah.
Or you could maybe air layer it here and use starting at where it has that bulge. So you could use it, but maybe it is a little more work if you want a nice tapered trunk. Any other ideas on the first tree here? If not, we'll go to the second tree. So what do we think about this one? Dane.
Great character with the bark on the trunk. Also seems to have a decent amount of taper.
Yeah, so this tree was it must have been taller at some point, and it broke here, and it seems like there's a break here, so that's why it's hollow all the way down. So that adds a little bit to the sense of age there. Any other pros or cons about this tree here? Number 2?
How tall is that up to the second break?
I think this probably was about a foot, maybe a little more.
Okay, so you could do something at the top of that, still have the story for the bottom without it being out of proportion.
Potentially, yeah. Kevin, you had a point?
Con being as hollow, so it may rot out faster.
It may rot out faster, that's true. So if you are somebody that likes deadwood on a deciduous, you have to be aware that it will eventually rot. You can use some certain techniques like wood hardener to slow that process. Any other points on this second tree here? Then we'll go to the third tree. So this is a much smaller tree. Both of these are a little bit smaller than those ones. Did we have any pros and cons on the third tree? Richard?
Pro, because what it had to do when it was growing was to work its way through the litter, and you have movement lower, very low on the base, and that's a very desirable thing to have. You don't want a straight tree and all of a sudden move into a question mark.
Yeah.
So all that undulating growth action gave you a good start with that as far as movement is concerned.
Yeah, oftentimes if you're looking for smaller plants, especially like seedlings in the forest, they do have some movement like this as they're trying to escape the leaf litter, like you're saying. So any other ideas for how you may style this third one, or pros or cons? Dane?
One con might be it looks like at certain junctures of the trunk, it looks like there were multiple branches growing, so you had some moments of reverse taper.
Like maybe here it's a little thicker, or
like bumps.
Yeah, that is true.
Did you turn that into a cascade?
Potentially.
Yeah.
The world is your oyster, Doug. Okay, so let's move on to the fourth tree. So pros or cons about this one. It used to be growing this way, and there was some kind of a break event here, and that caused a change in direction in the trunk. And I think this one was a beech, American beech.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like the slending and then straight concept.
A lot of times, a tree like that has fallen or been knocked over, and what you'll find is, where are the roots? Okay, if this is your trunk, your roots, your feeders could be way over here, which means, okay, you're glutton for punishment, go ahead, try and both.
Yeah, it is quite common in our forests for like big branches or whole trees to fall on other trees. So you'll find, if you look long enough, you'll find lots of trees like this, like Ken's saying. So, and it is worth kind of like digging around in the leaves to see where the roots are, like are there any surface roots there?
You also mentioned earlier diseases.
Mm-hmm.
Could that be a canker in that beach?
Oh, like along here?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It may be a scar from, whatever fell on it. So I don't know that I can say exactly what caused that.
No, the beech beeches shed their bark like that, they're paper beech. But look at that pine tree there, and look at that shape. I mean, that's easily, if you went this way with it, you have pretty much that, right? So that's why I enjoyed number 4.
Yeah, that is quite similar now that you mention it.
Yeah.
Okay, so good brainstorming there. So hopefully now you'll feel a little more comfortable going out and finding like oddball trees. Now, no tree in nature is really going to be perfect, like instant bonsai. That would be very rare to find. So you end up kind of looking around a forest and saying, and maybe marking trees, and then you'll kind of prioritize them. Like, okay, I think this one was the best one, so I'll take that one first. So that's how you may approach this. So now let's go over the actual tools that you need to dig. So this is my way of doing it that I kind of inherited from my bonsai teacher. If you ask other people online, they may tell you a little bit different, but I can tell you that it works for me and it worked for him. So that's my endorsement of it. So here I have actually an example of a tree that we did with this method. So the first tool that I really like, well actually, before I get into this, let's talk about the flagging tape. So I mentioned you may want to mark the trees in the forest that are interesting to you. So that way you can find it, let's say if you come back next year or the year after that. And then we have all these sorts of digging tools. I use a metal handle trenching shovel. The metal handle is very nice because you won't break it. And then there's some hand digging tools. I have this like hand pickaxe, which I have a full-size one that has not come in handy at all. But the hand-size one is very useful here in Ohio because usually the roots are kind of living on a surface layer, and then there's a big, pile of clay underneath that you have to get through to get the tree out. So this is pretty effective at getting through the clay that we have here in Ohio. Crowbar may be useful if you're digging somewhere with a lot of rocks, and gloves are nice because they help your hands not dehydrate as much. And then on this side, you'll probably use the loppers, your bonsai scissors, and a hand saw the most, depending on the size of the tree that you're working with. So now we can talk about this kind of example here. So when you're getting the tree out, when you're taking it home, what I do is I take one of these black contractor bags, and it's much thicker than a regular trash bag. So I can cut the bag along the seams so it's one sheet, and then I will wrap the roots with that bag, and I'll wrap them very tightly so that there's no like big air spaces basically. And then I'll wrap it with a crap ton of electrical tape. And the electrical tape is nice because it adheres to itself really well. It adheres to the bag a little bit, but mostly if you want to like get it very tight, you'll be adhering it to itself. And so everything all around, you can see I kind of went over multiple times. Now well, I guess we'll talk about this a little more later on. But that's the basic tool set you'll use. Oh. Okay, so if you're going to go out into nature to dig trees, you need to be aware of what's in nature that you have to look out for. Depending on where you are, you may have bears here in Washington or in North Carolina if you go there. More big bears in Alaska, Montana, So for those places, what's that?
Big bears clear 10 years ago.
Anyways, I must not have been here when that happened.
Yeah, no, it was a little while back.
But yeah, so if you're in a place that has bears, you want to bring some bear spray, maybe some bells on your pack or whatever. Another concern that I encountered in Nevada is there's scorpions living under the rocks. So if you pick up a rock, you want to do that very carefully. Yes, also rattlesnakes in Nevada and the desert areas of the Southwest.
Coral snakes.
What's that?
Coral snakes in Missouri.
Yeah, so the basic gist here is just know what's in your woods so that you don't get bit or maimed by a goat or poisoned by a scorpion, And in Ohio, luckily, there's not as much to be worried about. Our biggest concern here that I found are ticks. So the solution there is to wear some anti-tick clothing. It may look a little dorky, but if you have hiking boots and your long socks with your pants stuffed in there, that works pretty well to prevent the ticks from getting into you. So, and I really like the very first time of year when you can dig here because usually the ticks aren't awake yet. So that's like the prime time, is when you first start to see any movement in your branches. Okay, so now we're going to go into actually how to dig a tree in the wild. And this kind of relates to Zach's point about like finding out what's collectible. So here in Ohio, my general strategy is I'll usually dig down around the trunk until I start to see some lateral roots. And lateral roots, if you're lucky, or on a lot of trees in our forest, you'll find that they're already right at the surface. So you don't have to dig in those cases. But lateral roots are a good sign because it shows that the roots are dividing and it's not just relying on one taproot. And that means that it's probably a good sign that you'll have fine roots closer to the trunk. But in the case of this sweet gum that I was trying to dig it this year, I dug down and it was very wobbly and there were no lateral roots. So I think on the next slide, oh yeah, here, this is what you can do if you find a tree like that. No lateral roots, it may not survive if I dug it this year. So what I did was, oops, I forgot this was a discussion question. Anyways, I'll just go through it. So option one for something that doesn't seem like it has great roots, just don't dig it and leave it alone. And that tree can stay in nature and potentially you may come back to it later on to see how it's doing and maybe it will have more collectible roots at that time. In this case, there's a couple different techniques for root enhancement. That's a root enhancement is a technique coined by my teacher. He used to go to the dry side of the Cascade Mountains and he would bring a bucket of sphagnum moss and he would put it on the trunk of these ponderosa pines that he wanted to dig and he would wrap it with the contractor bag and then he would come back a couple times a year and check on them and eventually that little package would be full of roots. It just naturally colonized that wet environment. And then he could just cut off everything else and it would rely on that little amount of white roots to survive. So that's kind of a life hack there, I guess, for bonsai artists. But you can also do, in this case, a ground layer is what I went with. So I scraped off the bark on one side and then maybe next year, maybe the year after that, I'll go back and see, did any roots develop there? And then if there's good roots there, I can cut off the taproot. And so these techniques, they generally require that if the tree is in some place that you can return to it. It's not like a now or never dig. Not like the Whitehall dig that we did this year where everything was getting bulldozed. So if it is a now or never dig and it's a really nice tree, you may just want to go for it and then hope and pray and see what little tricks you can use to help it grow roots, but there's no guarantees there.
Right?
Yeah.
Going back to your ground layer.
Yep.
Do you ever use something like cloning gel on that to improve the chances?
Yes, so I haven't done a test to see is it better with it or without it. In this case, I didn't have the cloning hormone on me, so I just did it without it. And this is it's an okay tree. I'd be happy to dig it, but I won't mind if it doesn't make it, I guess. So, and I only did half of the roots, so I can also do the other half at another time, maybe if I go back with the rooting hormone. Any other questions here or ideas, Richard?
You dug 140 trees. How many trees do you have in your collection?
I do not have 140 trees
Okay.
because, a certain amount of them don't make it. But
also,
yeah, one year I did have an area of my trees that were in recovery. They were along a fence in my yard. And the neighbor's car somehow ran over that whole area, plowed through the fence. So those trees are a wash. But anyways, I have a decent amount now because if you keep doing this, you accumulate trees pretty well this way. Okay, so now we're going to get into how you actually go about and dig a tree. Because I know this is a big question that people have. And here I'm mostly focused on digging trees in Ohio. But if you have an interest in traveling to other places, we can talk about that too. So in Ohio, we get, like I said, a lot of the fine roots are at the surface. And then you usually get some very strong anchoring roots that go through the clay and hold the tree in place. So my strategy is I start with my trenching shovel and I'll make a perimeter. And I'll go all the way around. And you may leverage the tree a little bit as you go. And if you hit a root that prevents your shovel from going in, then I'll use the hand tools to find where that root is and cut that. And then you can keep going around the circle until all the circle is dug. And on a bigger tree, I start, like this is the sugar maple I showed earlier. So I started with a very wide circle, but I think it ended up being closer to this because I had to carry the thing out of there. But, so that's always a consideration. A rule of thumb, maybe if you go like one of the trunk distance on each side, maybe a little more than that, that should be pretty good. But that's part of why I look to see, are these roots dividing? I look at the source. Am I seeing some smaller roots coming off of that trunk or of those major roots? And that kind of boosts my confidence that this is a good area to dig in. Okay, so after you've made your trench, you'll start to pry the tree up, and you'll kind of be able to feel where the tree is being held in place. Like if you can pry it only a certain distance, it's kind of hard to describe, but if you come to the honeysuckle dig next year, or in May, we may have another invasive dig at a different suburb that wanted to do one. So if you want to come to those, I can show you the technique. Then wiggle it around and get a feeling for where is the tree still attached. And you'll come in with your hand tools and start to scrape underneath to separate this root pad from whatever is holding it in place. And eventually, you'll find the roots that are kind of downward going and holding it there. And you can cut those, and then eventually, before you know it, the tree will come up. So also, once you have the tree up, I'll try to kind of knock off the clay layer because there's not really any fine root colonized in that area, just thicker roots. And so you only need the top layer pretty much. And this instruction set is basically for trees that have really nice root pads, which a lot of the older trees will. But on younger trees, it'll be a lot easier to dig them, for one. But you're not going to get like an intact root ball. So that's one thing to think about. And but younger trees usually survive better anyways. Okay, so then now we can talk about that Rose of Sharon that's all wrapped up there. So the strategy here is you take your contractor bag, you wrap it, and then you attach the electrical tape to make that very tight wrap. Now, here's the part that's maybe a little controversial nowadays, but this is the technique that was taught to me. So what I do for a lot of trees, especially like the bigger ones, is I will leave them in that package for multiple years. So that's part of why it's important to wrap it very tightly. And then you can poke holes with your bonsai scissors in the top, in the sides, and the bottom, so that lets water enter and leave. So it's not going to drown in there. And just make sure that you can actually check the soil to see if it's wet. But so this is the method that my bonsai teacher swears by. Now, I'll tell you about the alternatives, but let me tell you first why he suggests this method. So Dan digs a lot of very ancient trees like that juniper that I shared, and they generally, you want to do minimal amounts of root disturbance. And he found that if he was unwrapping them and potting them, that was a second act of root disturbance, especially if you're, like he was doing, digging several days drive away from home, bringing the trees home and then potting them up. It's almost like you are insulting the tree twice, and that may reduce your chance of success. Also, this is a very convenient method. You don't have to go buy wood to make any wood boxes. But, so now we're getting into the alternatives. So Dwight's tree back there has a very good example of a wooden box that he made himself. And so that's a very good technique, especially if you have a long, irregular, or like a weirdly shaped root ball and you want to get it into a shallow pot and you don't have any pots that are that size. Ken, did you have a point about that?
No, wrapping in the black plastic, roots grow much better in warm soil. So
yeah.
That's going to be another advantage.
Yeah. That may help because the plastic will kind of get heated up in the sun.
How does it breathe? I mean, we use burlap, so it breathes oxygen.
Some people do use burlap. Like if you've heard of Larry Jackal, he does a lot of ponderosa collecting in the Rockies. So his method is very similar, but he'll wrap with wet burlap instead of these. Now, I've had good success with this just by poking holes throughout to let some water in, let some air in. But it's one that I'm hesitant to recommend because I'm in the middle of doing some experiments to see, like, is this actually better than other methods, but I haven't reached any conclusions yet. But I'll tell you, this works. The wooden boxes work. Or if you have a pot that's already appropriately sized, that can work too. The main thing that you want to do after you get the tree home, now we're going to get into the potting part, is you don't want to prune the roots too much more after you already got it out of the ground. You want to keep as much of the fine root as you can, and that will maximize your chance of that tree surviving. So here I have a diagram of how the tree intakes water. Everybody may recall that the fine roots do all of the work to import new water into the tree. So that's why the fine roots are so important. And in order for the tree to recover and survive, it has to grow new fine roots. So the strategy that I use for my aftercare is I will put the trees in the shade for a couple weeks, maybe even months, and that will allow the stored energy to build new roots while reducing the tree's demand for water from getting heated up too much. Also, you can keep the tree hydrated. You want to monitor your watering closely. You don't want to overwater. You don't want to underwater. So you kind of have to check on these things regularly. And as we have a frost coming up, I think, tomorrow, you want to avoid letting your trees freeze after they've been repotted, as you all have already been working on that, or after you've been digging them. So new roots are more sensitive to dehydration or to being killed by freezing. Zach?
If you've got some place that you can keep the root ball, for instance, I have a lot of the trees that I got from Ken Booth last month on my top tub. So they're getting a little bit of heat through the insulation on that. So if you have something similar, use it.
That's a good idea. I haven't heard of that trick before. But Doug.
So you dug this tree up. It's in a black contractor's bag.
Yes.
You brought it home.
Yes.
You may have built a wood pot for it. Yes or no?
Yeah.
And so what are you doing for soil on this thing?
That's a good question. So let me take one step back first that I kind of skipped over. So let's say you do the wood pot technique. I would unwrap your little packaging and I would do minimal root disturbance of the root ball. I would just surround it with the soil. And so the conventional wisdom is that pumice, which is the volcanic soil, you can mostly get it at bonsai stores, or if you have any connections in the West Coast, it's very available there. So pumice is a good thing to use for soil for a freshly collected tree because it promotes a lot of air, promotes a lot of new fine roots. I'm experimenting right now with perlite as a substitute because that's much more available here. So next year I may have an update on that. But you could also try your regular bonsai soil. You may also try other substitutes. I don't have enough data yet to give you a firm recommendation on a cheaper alternative than pumice.
So are you knocking all the soil off and putting this stuff in, or are you just adding it with the soil you already have?
Yeah, so some people, especially for deciduous trees like this Rose of Sharon, they may be more aggressive at knocking the soil off. I am hesitant to do that, especially for species I haven't dug a lot of before, because some species that you may not expect also need their mycorrhizal root associations, like the mountain laurel that I dug up and that didn't make it. I learned afterwards that that species is particularly sensitive to getting dug because it is one that relies on those mycorrhizal roots. Zach?
If you go back in the newsletter articles 2 or 3 years, there was an article where we did a root over rock with Ken Schultz, and the whole bottom third of that pot was perlite. And then we just had the roots and the other stuff sitting on top of the soil. He did another take on that, I think earlier this year or late last year. And you can see that the tree's doing fine. Whether it would have done better with or without the perlite, who knows? But it didn't seem to be hurting any.
That's good to know. Richard, do you have a point?
Pine trees hate to be buried.
Yeah, that's a good point. So
there's clay there. I got a guy who dug up a cream pine, and I kept all the top. I kept the clay. I chopped off some of the clay, kept a nice, and then put it in a large pot, that stuff, and then let it sit for 2 years until it could grow through that. If you bare root that thing, forget it. A lot of conifers just hate that.
Yeah, that is true.
That's one point I wanted to make.
Thanks for bringing that up, because I mentioned the deciduous, but I didn't mention the conifer side. But generally speaking, you can be a little more aggressive on deciduous also.
Yes.
Yeah. Brent?
Just one quick thing, I've been spotting pumice in big bags at like the local grow shops.
Really? Is it, how does the price compare, do you think?
I bought a bag, this tall for $70.
Okay.
A good sized bag.
That's pretty big.
So, it's a nice crossover.
Good to know. So the hydroponics type stores, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Okay, good to know. And then one other point I had here is that pruning or partial defoliation may help your success, especially if you're digging at the wrong time of year. So generally you want to do your digging in the spring before bud break, kind of the same timing as repotting. But this boxwood and the boxwood in the back, I dug both of them in June of 2020, or 2021. And at that time I did thin the foliage. My hypothesis here is that reduces the demand for water at the hotter time of year. So I have no data really to show that that's like 100% what you should do, but I have these trees all survived, the ones that I did that treatment with. So that's what I'll say for now. Jerome?
That brings up a question. That's a Rosa Sharon there.
Yeah.
It looks like it's got a lot of back budding on it. When
Yes.
did it start to bud out?
So I chopped it all and it had no budding. And then now that might have been almost a month ago that I dug it and chopped it. So it's just starting to do the back budding now.
Looks like it has a good buttress base, does it?
Yeah, there's definitely some nabari, some surface roots there.
I mean, buttressing where it flares out, it's thicker at the base.
It is a little bit thicker, but not dramatically so right now. Yeah. Zach?
On the boxwood conversation, I have found that people that know me know I have a lot of boxwoods. I have found that where I was not as aggressive in removing foliage, they did more poorly, and I lost more of those than the ones where I pruned them back severely.
Yeah, that's what I found at the same. Actually, there was a group of smaller ones that I dug a month earlier, and those I didn't really thin at all. But even though they were dug earlier at the cooler time of year, I had more failure there. So anecdotally, that's what I'm seeing too, which is part of why I'm suggesting. Like if you have a tree that you have to dig in the summer, it's going to get thrown out otherwise. I may try doing some chopping, some thinning that way, or at that time.
I mean, I've removed 90% of the green. That's severe.
As long as you leave some green on boxwoods, they usually do fine. So, any other questions here about basic aftercare? Okay, so here we're getting almost to the end. So I wanted to give you a taste of some of the advanced aftercare techniques that you can try. So the first one is a technique that came out of the UK. There's this guy, Tony Tickle, and he has black plastic trash bags. These are thinner than the contractor bags that I use. So they're thinner that they allow light in. And he will wrap a tree inside of that bag, and he mostly does this with species in the Rosaceae family. So that's hawthorns, cherries, apples, etc. Pears also. Anyways, and he will open that bag every day to spray water in to keep the humidity very high. So it's almost like a personal greenhouse for that tree. And he will keep the bag on until the tree starts to bud out. So he's shown on his YouTube channel, he's got like 4 videos on this. He's shown that this technique causes his trees to make many more back buds than if you don't use this technique. And then once the leaves start coming out, he will gradually remove the plastic bag, for progressively longer periods of time so that the foliage can kind of harden off to the less humid regular air that you would normally have. You can also use a greenhouse. So there's a common theme here. Raising the humidity reduces the demand for water, may promote survival of your trees. And then this is a suggestion that came from 2 different bonsai, I want to say professionals, but I think Bruce is kind of a professional. So Harry Harrington has an old article, he's also in the UK, an old article where he found that summer was the best time of year to dig his English oaks. And he found he had a higher failure rate digging in the spring before before buds open. For whatever reason, he found that oaks were kind of an exception there.
Oaks or fastidious trees, they hold their leaves forever, they take forever to bud, and then they hold them in the fall forever.
Yeah, they act a little different, so maybe that may be why he's observing this. But what he does is he will dig a tree in summer, an oak tree, and then he'll put it in a pot of water or a tub of water and leave it there for several weeks. And you can see here, the water is slowly evaporating, or it wasn't all the way up to the top originally. But what he says in his blog article is that this method allows the damaged roots to take in as much water as they need until they can repair and grow new roots. And then also this was a trick that Bruce Baker suggested in a different context. He said if you had a tree that you dug or maybe repotted that didn't wake up, didn't open its leaves, then you can also try putting it in a tub of water for a number of days. And usually once the tree starts leafing out, he said remove the tree from the water. So I just learned about this one, haven't tried it out yet, but I had one tree last year that I dug that never did wake up, so I'm wishing I had learned about it earlier. But and the last one is automated misting. So for junipers especially, this is a very useful technique if you're digging junipers. I've heard that you can dig junipers with barely any roots, and if you have high humidity, automated misting, you can get them to survive. And when Kevin and I visited Chase Rosade, he told us that back in California, when the Japanese professionals were there in the 70s, and they were digging up all these California junipers from the desert, many of them died until one day someone tried just leaving a hose above the plant and letting it drip water constantly onto that juniper. And then the success rate of digging California junipers skyrocketed after that technique was kind of discovered. So you may try that for your trees as well. Okay, so now we're going to just talk briefly about the next steps for your whatever wild trees you dig, whether it be from an urban environment or from the forest here in Ohio. So this is what this tree looked like July 2021. It came from your house, Mouse. You may recognize it. So at that time, I thinned the tree, and here's what it looked like after I thinned it. I kind of cut off branches I knew I didn't need. They were too tall or didn't have taper. And then on other areas, I pruned back to green growth. So left green on every branch that I was thinking, maybe I'll use this branch in the future. And then I allowed it to recover for 1 year. Didn't do anything to it. Didn't do anything to it that first year. And you can see it grew very vigorously, back-budded a lot, became a lot more dense, and elongated some even too. So this is my criteria for any tree that I dig. I'm not going to touch it, not going to work on it until it's growing vigorously. Back-budding, elongating, or generally looking healthy. So that only took 1 year for this boxwood. And then last year I styled it. Let me move this out of the way. So yeah, last year I did first wiring of all the branches, and I did an additional cutback, and I carved these deadwood gins. And then now you see it today after it got its first repot. One other thing, Richard was talking about how conifers prefer not to be bare-rooted. And on any of my old Yamadori, I take the same approach. So even though the boxwood is not a conifer, I essentially did a half bare root on this tree because it's older and I don't want to be as aggressive and risk losing it after I put all of this work into it. So I cleared around the edges and especially the bottom to make it fit in the bonsai pot. And then on half of the trunk, I don't remember which half, I'll have to find out next time I repot. But I cleared away all the native soil on half of it and left the other half of the fine root ball intact. So that way, this half can kind of sustain the tree while this half is regrowing, if you imagine the root ball there. Trey?
Does that affect which size of the tree? Will it really die back face on which side, or doesn't really matter?
It may, depending on the species. So junipers have more of a lifeline kind of reliance, where one root corresponds to one branch on the tree. If you cut the branch, that root may die. If you cut the root, that branch may die. So I think most species that won't be an issue though. Dane?
Follow-up question. So for these trees that have been like a year or two after they were originally dug and they're showing signs that they're healthy, and we're looking to start getting them into an actual, bonsai pot, or at least moving that direction. What would be the soil mix you're looking for to start incorporating that in?
So whatever your regular bonsai soil is, after it's recovered in your kind of like aerating mix, in my case pumice or perlite or whatever you've been using, then I would use your regular bonsai soil after your first repot. Yeah. So the benefit of the regular bonsai soil is you may have some particles that retain a little more water. In my case, I use like bark chips. Everybody does their own soil mix. Not going to get into that here, but if you're using akadama to retain water, that works too. The main thing is the pumice or the perlite, if that turns out to be an effective method, is that promotes dense fine roots for recovery. But then the more water-retaining particles, like bark chips, like akadama, they also retain more fertilizer. So like for long-term health, you don't need to keep it in 100% pumice. So, any other questions about aftercare or like next steps after that? Oh, Ken.
Speaking of the quote-unquote one branch, one root thing, not that we collect many azaleas around here, but they are notorious for that.
Yes, I have heard that about them too.
The whole side of the tree.
Really?
Yeah, so it's maybe junipers and azaleas for sure. Let me know if anybody finds any other species. What's that?
Arborvitae.
Arborvitae. Okay, good to know. Dan?
Well, you're letting the tree recover after the initial thing. Do you fertilize?
Yeah, so I don't really fertilize in the first couple months because one thing I didn't mention, so the fine root tips, as it's first growing, they're more susceptible to all kinds of desiccation. If you add too much fertilizer, you can promote those the water leaving those roots. So kind of like with your repots, let it recover for a while before you start fertilizing. Any other questions on aftercare? Okay, so now my parting advice for you. So I want all of you, if you're interested in this, go forth and don't feel hindered in trying it out. Try to dig some trees. But my general advice on my own experience is be humble, start on smaller trees, and know that you can work your way up once you've kind of shown to yourself that you've got the hang of this. Younger plants, as I mentioned, are more likely to succeed, and they just tend to be more resilient. So when I'm looking at new species, I'll try to start with younger plants of that same species so I can kind of get a feel for what they like. And it's also great if you can start on trees that won't be missed. Oftentimes you can find people who are redoing their landscaping. They're tired of their boxwoods or want more cacti in this area, you know. So those kinds of people, if you know them from your network, then just kind of like talk to your neighbors, you know, see what they're doing. Sometimes you may even find they did all the work of digging up the tree and they just left it on the side of the road, and then you can go swoop in and plant it. So, yeah, those trees, they won't be missed if they die, and they're a good source of material for sure. So I didn't talk about like landscape trees quite as much as the wild trees, but it's just as good as a resource for us to explore. And as I mentioned, the older and larger trees, they tend to be more risky to dig. So I'm trying out some different things like doing trunk chops while they're in the ground, doing partial trenching before actually digging the trees out, or maybe even getting an oversized root ball, more than you think you need. So I'm hoping in the future that will improve my success there. And I also kind of touched on this a little bit when we were talking about the pitch pines. But if you're looking for a certain species, like if you're hell-bent on finding an American beech, you want to get to know where you can find that beech in our environment. Some species are more likely to be next to a creek or a river. Others like more sun, more dry areas. So that kind of thing, if you get into hiking, is a great hobby that goes along with bonsai. And then another final takeaway that I have for you all is don't feel like every time you go out you have to dig a tree. Because sometimes you may not find trees that are collectible, or you may not find ones that are interesting to you, in which case just enjoy your journey, your exploration, and you'll find another one next time. So, thank you. And one thing about this, I published an article last week on my website that has like a general protocol for digging trees, for aftercare. So if you want to refer back to that in the future, feel free to look at that. Thank you, Ryan.